There should have been an acknowledgement that when unilateralism comes into the world, it causes conflict. And so therefore, when the US dollar becomes the reserve currency, the Americans should not be able to use it to impose unilateralism or to impose their interests on the rest of the world. But clearly, they have not decided to make that the possibility. So now we are left with the option of starting to look at the alternative. And the alternative is the creation of another system, parallel and competitive to this unipolar system that is controlled by the Americans, if African countries are ever going to have a chance. We also have to teach African countries to stop being dependent from this particular system, but also at the same time to challenge these systems to adhere to rule of law and to adhere to a rule-based system.
So, Rutendo, just because I want to ask you one more thing about Zimbabwe and how you view and Zimbabwe now interacts in this kind of changed circumstance after what happened last year and the war that's going on in Ukraine and the fact that international relations itself is changing. So you're suffering from the fact that the United States and to a good part the Anglo-Saxon world is able to abuse its structural power. It's able to abuse the systems that it created in order to put pressure on you or to cut you off from all kind of international ways of doing business, of creating prosperity. Are you excited about the fact that Russia and China are currently working on alternative payment methods, that there seem to be new routes of then doing business? And is Chinese investment maybe going to be one way to develop despite these goddamn sanctions?
Yes, we believe that the Western world has created systems that were created off crimes against humanity like colonialism and slavery. They have built wealth to create the multilateral institutions whose wealth and money and capital is vastly created by the exploitation of the very same third world countries that they now take advantage of and exclude from the payment systems whenever they create laws and rules that they don't like. So in other words, they are trying to maintain the colonial system, the imperial system through neocolonialism by the use of the Bretton Woods and their institutions or the Paris Club. And this is very unfair. It is very unfair because when they created the Bretton Woods institutions and the Paris Club, they created them unilaterally as Western countries that had created the problems of the Second World War and the crimes of humanity of slavery and colonialism before, that it caused the instability and destabilization that forced them to create the Bretton Woods institutions and the multilateral institutions like the UN to try and ensure peace. And once they created those rules imposing their institutions on the world and making the United States dollar the reserve currency. Now, had they played fair, it would mean that those institutions are now international institutions which should be led multilaterally and not unilaterally by the same nations that created them. There should have been an acknowledgement that when unilateralism comes into the world, it causes conflict. And so therefore, when the US dollar becomes the reserve currency, the Americans should not be able to use it to impose unilateralism or to impose their interests on the rest of the world. But clearly, they have not decided to make that the possibility. So now we are left with the option of starting to look at the alternative. And the alternative is the creation of another system, parallel and competitive to this unipolar system that is controlled by the Americans, if African countries are ever going to have a chance. We also have to teach African countries to stop being dependent from this particular system, but also at the same time to challenge these systems to adhere to rule of law and to adhere to a rule-based system. So for instance, when the Financial Action Task Force is being utilized to exclude African countries from participation in the international financial system on the say-so of the Americans, we should be able to go back and look at the rules of the Financial Action Task Force, and we should be able to look at the equitability of those rules and to look at whether those rules adhere to rule of law. When the Financial Action Task Force blacklists the country or graylists the country, we should question how it's done. Where is the due process? Where was the nation tried? Where was the nation given an opportunity to answer? When financial action task force rules are being made international or unilateral rules, we must question how 7 countries called the G7 can create an institution that now begins to be seen as a multilateral institution when it created rules unilaterally at the exclusion of the rest of the world. We must force these institutions to become multilateral through the participation, collective participation, and ratification and signing up of these rules by the international community. And where that is absent, they should never be given the authority to influence multilateral rules. Then we must begin to push for Russia and China to successfully create an alternative system, or for BRICS to create an alternative system, so that we are not indebted and held as ransom by multilateral institutions created by the US. Because when a lot of us look at the situation we have with the North Atlantic Alliance organizations, we see them as American institutions. Because when we look at Europe, Germany today, it's a colony of the United States of America, something many Europeans don't know. Europe as a whole is occupied by NATO and has got American bases today because America basically conquered Europe with the Marshall Plan. Second World War destroyed Europe. Europe needed to be rebuilt. It's the Marshall Plan that was used to rebuild. That was a US dollar-based system of loans, which today are revolving loans in Europe that have allowed America to control Europe. So the question is, when Europe makes rules with America, are those international rules or are those American rules? Japan is a colony of the United States till today because of the very same Potsdam Agreement and the very same settlements that happened after the Second World War. Japan was resurrected by America. Its companies are controlled through American companies like BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity and voucher funds that went and took over the stock exchange of the Japanese, while Japan is also occupied by over 50,000 US soldiers. Prove that this is a land under occupation. Can these countries forming the G7 then be trusted to make international rules when they are actually proxies of the American order? No, they can't. So we need an order that is international, multilateral, that is going to give us a fairer and better way of existence, not just the way that the Americans want to exist in order to advance their foreign policy.
The problem is they will never do that. And I think that's what China kind of took out as a learning outcome about 10 years ago, trying for 20 years to collaborate even more, like 35, 40 years, and never getting anywhere, never being at the big boys table, never being asked to join these institutions, never having a Chinese head of the IMF or so on and so forth. And they gave it up. So they said, this is not going to work. And Russia gave it up to try for 20 years, 25 years to kind of follow the general way of everybody doing everything, and then just ending up with all of the NATO weapons pointing at Moscow, and then even trying to take over Ukraine in order to get these things even closer. So these countries gave it up. And from how I see it, a large part of the world, South America, Africa, you don't believe this Western BS anymore either, right? You just don't believe in the entire rhetoric also of the neocons and open up your economy. So for you, the way that now international relations is changing, beyond like just trying to repair the institutions that the Europeans and the Americans will never open to you, do you see ways of creating new institutions through BRICS? And is there already something that's helping you now? I mean, is a new payment system emerging or not for Zimbabwe?
Look, the problem that we've got with our leaders in Africa is that they're still caught up in the nostalgia of colonialism, because a lot of the leaders that we have in Africa were middle-class citizens during colonialism. They were the better blacks, so to speak, during colonialism. And a lot of them felt they lived a privileged life, and they still want to reinstitute or bring back some of that, what they had during that period. And we're saying that the majority of Africans were not comfortable then. So this is why the resistance is coming from African leaders who still want the US dollar as a payment system for inter-Africa trade. And the question we're asking them is, why should you receive US dollars from another African country in a trade? Why are US dollars so important for you? Why is it so important for you to hold US dollars?
But isn't South Africa working against this now?
South Africa has changed. It has shifted. So South Africa was always known as a Western proxy. And when Cyril Ramaphosa, the new president, came in, he was seen as a Western puppet. But he has shifted so drastically in his position towards the West into an anti-Western position and a pro-Russian, pro-Chinese position, which has surprised and shocked everybody in Africa. And the reason is they're realizing that as long as they're proxies of the Americans are the ones in control of not only South Africa, but they're the ones that are geopolitically in control of Africa, which South Africa hopes to control. South Africa is the biggest economy. I think right now it's the second biggest economy after Germany. But when we look at it per capita, it's still the strongest economy on the continent, still the most industrialized. And the South Africans hope to use that as a geopolitical leverage to control Africa so that whenever the Chinese, the Russians, or the Americans want to come and do business in Africa, they come through the gateway of South Africa, which then gives South Africa power. But the South Africans have realized that they will never be in control of Africa as long as they are proxies of the Americans, because then the Americans are the ones that are in charge. And the South Africans are uncomfortable with the Americans being superpowers on a continent that South Africa feels it is their terrain and it is their interest. And they also feel like that because when the apartheid government existed, the Americans and the West gave the apartheid government the power to control Africa as the superpower of Africa. And the ANC is wondering why they're not being given the same recognition and the same authority to actually treat Africa as their backyard in which they are the superpower. So this is what they're fighting. And I think with their shift to BRICS, it is a way for them to strong arm and arm twist the United States by showing them that we've got alternative partners. I also believe that the ANC looks at the fact that in future, at some point, they might clash with the Americans. We've already seen the South African financial system being grey-listed. That is a form of sanctions. We're hearing the talk of AGOA being cancelled because of the allegations that the South African government put weapons on a Russian military ship, which we all think is nonsense because Russia surely doesn't need weapons from South Africa. But I think the South African government sees itself clashing with America at some point. And if they do clash with America at some point, I believe that they need protection of China and Russia. And hence they're beginning to align themselves more with the Chinese and Russians. They also understand that when sanctions come, they're going to be isolated from the international payment systems and financial systems. So South Africa has actually become one of the countries that is proactively pushing for the creation of a BRICS currency and an alternative payment system outside the American payment system, because the South Africans learned from the Zimbabwe situation that if sanctions are to come on South Africa, they will be isolated, they will be removed from payment systems. And if they want to continue to maintain the economic power, they're going to need alternatives to the United States and European system. So they are moving away from that European American system. And we are trying to say to the Zimbabwean government, together with other African governments, we have to start changing the rules, even on the current rule book. So for instance, we know that the Americans force governments, banks, and financial systems to comply with their designations to remove certain people from payment systems. And we are saying to banks, to governments in Africa, make laws in Africa now, today, to stop banks from canceling people's accounts, to stop banks from denying payment systems, and to stop banks that are domiciled and registered in Africa from complying with illegal Western economic coercion. They must comply with the laws of Africa. And if they don't comply with the laws of Africa and there are banks in Africa, then they should lose their licenses. No African company, government, or person should ever have their accounts closed on the dictation of the American government. No African bank should refuse to process payments or refuse to give loans to any government, any company on the African continent based on implementing or over complying with illegal sanctions. So we're saying within the current framework, there is so much that our parliaments on the African continent can do in line with what the Special Rapporteur wrote in a report on secondary sanctions and overcompliance, asking our financial systems not to overcomply and to adhere to Western sanctions. We must also challenge our banks not to follow Financial Action Task Force rules that are not multilateral and rules that are not in the interests of African countries. So for instance, where the Americans say, you must shut off this person from the international banking system because they are money laundering, we need that money laundering to be proved in a court of law. It shouldn't just be on the say-so of the Americans that accounts must be closed, people are money launderers just because the Americans say so. Why? Because when Glencore was caught recently, having been flying millions of dollars across the world, and they were bribing leaders of oil-rich countries, Glencore was found guilty in British courts, and when it was found guilty, Glencore's accounts were not closed. No bank de-risked from Glencore. No bank refused to clear payments from Glencore. So why is it that when African companies are just said to be money laundering by a documented, said to be money laundering by a bogus report written by institutions sponsored by the Americans, immediately banks de-risk and close those accounts, but they don't do it to Glencore? Why is it that proceeds from colonial companies on the African continent that have pillaged and raped Africa, that have caused genocides, continue to flow through the banking system and are never considered as money laundering, yet we all know that the funds created by Anglo-America and a lot of these mining companies of the colonial era are dirty funds. They are funds based on mining rights gained from colonialism. They are funds gained from slavery of Africans. They are funds gained from colonial occupation. That is blood money. But it makes its way into the financial system without ever being called proceeds of money laundering, yet we all can see the predicate crime that is behind those funds. So clearly, money laundering laws, the Financial Action Task Force, does not exist to keep the financial system clean. It exists to control African funds, Asian funds, and funds from the global south of brown nations so that they cannot compete with the West. And it's time that we use existing laws while creating alternative financial systems in order for us to fight this.
A very naive question, but is it possible for African countries to work, for example, through or with the Bank for International Settlement? Because that thing is even older than the Bretton Woods institutions, and it is extraterritorial. It is one of the most difficult things to kill, and it's actually real shareholder led. So any member bank, which are central banks, actually has a seat at the table. What are your thoughts?
I don't think we can work with the Bank of International Settlements until they begin to acknowledge other countries on a fair grounding. But the only reason why we have to depend on that Bank of International Settlements is because of the use of the US dollar. 70%, 75% of the international trade that takes place is taking place in US dollars. And this is how we give precedence to the Bank of International Settlements. The moment we stop using the US dollar as a reserve currency, the moment we stop using the US dollar as a payment for oil, the moment we stop using a US dollar as a means for balancing payments between nations, that institution becomes irrelevant. That institution becomes redundant. And that is why we have to fight to make other currencies more important than the West Anglo-Saxon currencies. And that can only be done by the BRICS creating its own currency, and us ensuring that we trade with countries like Russia, China, and amongst ourselves in our own currencies instead of continuing to use the US dollar. Because we are the one that the US dollar and its institutions' prominence by continuing to use it and depending on it. And we are saying to African leaders, stop treasuring the US dollar just because you want to have savings in US dollars, you want to go for holidays in the West, you want to have houses in the West, you want your children to go to school in the West. It's time you start looking at your children going to school in your own countries, on the African continent, in China and elsewhere other than America, so that we stop using this currency that is destroying a lot of the world and making trade in the world unfair, unequal, and making it the opposite of what GATT was created for.
I mean, the only thing you need is currency swaps with these other institutions. The problem is you need a lot of them in order to make multilateral trade work. But that's something that we are seeing right now. Countries are making agreements that they exchange each other's currency so that you can pay for the goods in the other denominated in the other currency. Is that something that Zimbabwe is also going to go after, currency swap agreements?
We are currently saying currency swap is not important because currency is just a piece of paper. So why are we focused on a warehouse receipt or a piece of paper instead of focusing on what it is that the world has always traded, which is real money, real value that is in gold and resources? So we're saying to the government of Zimbabwe, start basing the currency of Zimbabwe on your resources, on our gold, on our resource reserves, our lithium reserves, so that what we exchange with the world is what the world needs, real value and not pieces of paper. Because as long as we're going to be trading pieces of paper that are influenced by psychology much more than value, we're always going to be playing on the back foot. African currencies will always be seen as inferior, yet all the resources that are needed by the world are African currencies, African resources. So why don't we base our trade on the value of our resources and back up our warehouse receipts with what it is that we have in our warehouse, underground, or as our resource store? Because that is how it is that the Middle East was able to create currencies that matter and able to lift their nations up, is that they back their currencies on oil. They back their currencies on the reserves of oil that they carry. Now, we believe that oil is a very important resource, but lithium, gold, platinum, and the resources that Africa has, cassiterite, tantalite, cobalt, those are the resources that actually run industry. Those are the resources that run the machines that need petroleum. So why can't we give those as the same amount of value, if not more value than the oil? And this is what we're trying to.
I have a disagreement here with you about the theory of money, I believe, but we can leave that aside, because the problem is that all of these goods need to be denominated in something, and it's always the piece of paper in the end that then serves as a go-between in order to do the exchange.
But who said that? Because the world has been trading for over 3,000 years without denomination of trade and value through a piece of paper. So when did it start?
You need some denomination in gold or in something, and one piece of it, 2 pieces or 3 pieces of it.
Very good. And that's why I keep saying that we ultimately have to go back to the resource, to the true value. Because this piece of paper that you're talking about actually is worthless. It's created by fiction. It is a fiat currency. It has no value. So it's a piece of paper one country can print over other countries only because either there's psychological importance given to that nation, or more importantly, that nation has forced with its armies to control resources that matter. And the Americans have controlled the fuel. The piece of paper itself has no meaning. The piece of paper itself has no basis. It is the underpinning resource that the Americans control that is giving value to the currency.
Agreed. But it's really important that we can put these numbers into spreadsheets, because banking at the end of the day is nothing else but settling spreadsheets among each other. And then that makes people say, like, okay, sure, if you give me that number in my spreadsheet, then I will say that the goods can come to you, and vice versa. That's why I see a point in it, but I think we would need more time to actually discuss this theory of exchange.
Yes, but if the spreadsheets were all about simply trading what you owe me versus what I owe you, there would be no complications. But the moment we've got speculation, the moment we've got derivatives, the moment we've got gambling with monies on the stock markets and the money markets, that distorts the entire thing, and it does not become what it is that you're saying the whole situation should be all about. And it's that manipulation by greedy people, greedy nations that have no real value, but they continue to create a lot of alchemy in order to control the resources of other nations is where we have a problem. Hence, some of us are saying, let's bring it back to basics to avoid a situation where other people utilize mechanisms, gambling and leverage to gain control of what it is that doesn't belong to them in the first place, because that changes the whole purpose of that ledger, and that changes the whole purpose of I owe you and you owe me. Because now,
no, absolutely agreed. But it's really fundamental that there's different theories of what money is and how money works. And depending on what you believe, you will have completely different preferences of what the state should do. So it is a very important issue, actually. I subscribe to modern monetary theory, but because the West actually tried for a century now to do neocolonialism by selling the idea that, just use our currency and everything is fine.
But that is the problem with modern economic theory and modern monetary theory, is that it is a Western system. It is a Western system created by nations that had no resources that is being imposed on the world. And that's why some of us do not feel that is the best system of exchange. Because what we're doing at the end of the day is we are not exchanging. We're actually creating mechanisms of gambling to create a financial system that doesn't work for Africans. And so we need a theory that's going to be created by anybody other than the Western theory, because the Western theory is failing currently, and it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah. Okay, I agree with you. We need to think about mechanisms that work and also take the stranglehold away. But that's probably going to be the subject of another video, because Rutendo, I've been taking up already so much of your time. Is there anything that you still would like to add to the viewers?
I think at the end of the day, this perspective that I'm giving is a new perspective. We have an intellectual deficit in the global intellectual sphere and academic sphere, where the views and perspective are always Eurocentric. It is always the European perspective. And even when people like me have something to say about the sanctions, about the world order, about the illegalities of Western system, we never get heard, because the Western system is a way of silencing and sidelining voices that are critical of its system. But when you have a system that is immune to critique, immune to adjustment, it becomes a system that cannot survive or evolve. And this is why it's very important that we get to this point right now, where other voices need to start being heard in the academic sphere for us to come up with new thoughts, which is why right now you talked about the financial system. And I brought the aspect that the financial system is a Western financial system that is toxic and inimical to the world. It's a perspective you would never have, and you would never think of a theory outside the current system if you didn't hear the third world perspective that says we cannot continue to use this gambling system. We need something else. Only when we open up to each other and listen to other ideas and alternative ideas, and we stop having a Eurocentric ideas-based system, can we start creating something evolutionary that is evolving, that is changing, and that could potentially benefit the whole of humanity. Because remember, the third world is not out to try and take over from the West. We are saying humanity has to coexist, work together for the benefit of humanity and for the evolution of humanity. Right now, with the Western-centric system, we're either going to die because of a lack of resources, pollution, global warming, or nuclear implosion, mutual assured destruction. We've got to retrace our steps and relook at other models that are not just about dominance and the Machiavellian system of existence.
I thank you for these words, which I full-heartedly support. Rutendo, we will speak soon again.
Thank you so much.